The hospice house that I work at was previously a children's psych facility. Upstairs is the hospice house, and downstairs is a small like assisted living/respite for the PACE participants. I could write a book about all the stuff I experienced. I worked there several years ago, then left and recently came back. They did a huge remodel last year, and since then, I guess don't have as much activity, because none of the newer staff have ever experienced anything, and the two OGs said they don't really ever notice anything anymore either. One of the girls from downstairs said they still hear kids playing all the time. My grandma was a patient there, not quite 2 years before I started working there. She ended up going home to pass but had been there for a few weeks in room 138. A couple of co-workers had also had family in that room. One night, one of the RNs came down to where we were sitting and said, "Can you go help your patient in 38 with the f-?" They called the desk, and all you can hear is rustling in the background. The other CNA and I looked at each other because there wasn't a patient in that room. So we went in to see, and the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and we both got goosebumps. Several months later, we had forgotten about it. It was the other CNA and I again, but this time, different RNs. So one of the RNs comes down and tells us, "Hey, the patient in 38 called the desk and asked if someone was going to check on him." So again, we look at each other and ask the RN if Heck said what he wanted, and she said, "No, he just said his name was Derek, and he wanted to know if someone was going to check on him." Fast forward another several months. I'm sitting at the desk filling out my report sheet and the phone rings. I look at the caller ID. It's room 138. I pick it up and just hear rustling in the background, but no one says anything. It happened at least one other time on a night I wasn't there to the same RN it happened to the first time, because the next night when I worked, she had me come sit with her because she was spooked. One night, the same RN, ghosts always messed with her BC, she was scared, came down and asked me to come sit with her. She was sitting next to the staff entrance and kept hearing someone knocking, and she was afraid it was someone wanting to steal drugs or something. The glass was frosted, so you couldn't really see anything, but it did look like there was an outline of someone standing there. So we went to the front door to look and see if we saw anyone. No one was there, so we went back and sat down. Sure enough, we hear knocking again. I thought maybe it was the patient in the room next to the door, so we went to check on her. She told us she was okay and didn't need anything, but she did keep hearing someone knock on her door and wondered what she should do because no one answered when she told them to come. Another night, we had a patient pass right at shift change, and we were getting 2 admissions back to back. So we went and did post-mortem care really quick because the other admission was coming any minute. We gorget to open the window. The funeral home comes, we get everyone settled, and we sit down to chart. Then, the emergency broadcast sound, like when there's a storm or Amber Alert or something, plays out of nowhere. None of the TVs around us were on, and the weather radio didn't go off. Normally, the sound plays a couple of times, and the person will announce whatever the broadcast is or say it's a test. The sound only played once, and no announcement was made. We thought it was weird, but whatever. So later in the night I go get us all food. I come back, and everyone is sitting there waiting on food. The pager starts going off, and it's the tone that plays when a bathroom call light is going off or when someone rings the doorbell. I had just come in from outside, so I know no one is out. It's a bathroom call light, but the patient in that room was completely bed-bound. So we go in there, and the call light is pulled down, but the patient is sound asleep. It's probably half an hour later, and the same exact thing happens in a different room. We realize we didn't open the window after the patient passed, so we went in and opened it, and nothing else happened the rest of the night. Sometimes weird things would happen, then we would go do our rounds, and someone would be gone. One night, we were standing at the center nurses' station talking to one of the nurses on our way to start rounds. Out of the corner of my eye I saw a flash of light in the foyer area. It almost looked like a glare from a door being opened, but no one was over there. I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me, but the other girl saw it too. So we go down, and in the first room we go to, the patient is gone. We let the nurse know and she doesn't believe us because she had just checked on him 5 minutes before and he was still alive. My father had a pretty serious stroke back in 2004, was unconscious for about 2 weeks, and spent a total of almost 3 months in the hospital. I used to visit him every day from morning until night. We didn't have any insurance at the time, so he had to stay in a ward with up to 7 other patients at a time, although usually it was 3 to 4 patients. One of the patients was a man in his mid to late 60s. He was a very kind man whose bed was directly in front of my father's. One day I came back from a quick lunch break only to find my father sleeping, and there was nothing on the TV for me to watch. I was bored and sort of zoned out, staring in the general direction of the elderly patient in front of me, who happened to be getting a visit from his kids and grandchildren. As I was zoned out, I started to notice something floating above this man. I looked up and saw 3 shadowy figures floating in a circular pattern around. They looked like 3 people wearing dark cloaks, but with no hands or feet, and seemed to be diving in and out of a hole I couldn't see. One moment they would disappear into the hole, and the next they would pop right back out. I sat there stunned as I watched this, and that's when one of them broke off from the 3 and floated in my direction. It got right in my face, and I just backed my head as far back as I could in the chair I was sitting in. After that it floated back to the other 3 and then they all went out the back wall and disappeared. I had the most sickening feeling that this man was going to die. I just knew that these things were there because he wasn't going to make it. The elderly patient had been fine the whole time I had known him, but later that night he started complaining about stomach pains. The next day he was moved to the private room next to ours, and the day after that I ran into his daughter who was crying her eyes out. Knowing the answer, I asked her what's wrong. She said, "My father died today, he was fine, and then he just got sicker and died. We still don't know what happened." I felt so sad for her and that lovely family, but there was no point in telling her what I saw, so I kept it to myself. To this day I'm still not 100% sure of what I saw, but it was pretty disturbing if I'm being honest. I was rotating in a rural country hospital. I was on nights with a rural family/emergency physician, so we basically took care of the entire hospital at night while we were on shift. We would typically get around 1 point an hour. So on a dead night, the nurses would tell me to just go sleep in a point bed on the top floor of the hospital. The hospital top level wasn't being used, so employees would sometimes sleep there if they were working nights. I find a room and it is overlooking the small city park. The snow is coming down, and the halogen lights are the only thing cutting through the thick snow-covered darkness. I go to sleep, and then I wake up about an hour later super cold. The old school heater was next to the window, so I got up to turn it back on. Click. 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 I hear as I turn the dial to heat. Only, I didn't turn it a 3rd time. The 3rd click was a soft click on the glass window. I look out of the window and see a figure in the snow standing in the park, under the orange glow of the halogen lights, looking at the hospital. No, they were looking at me. Chills instantly went through me, and I drew away from the window. I looked back out the window, and there was no more dark figure to be seen. I looked for a trail of footprints, but in that moment the winter storm really picked up and I could no longer see out the window. I went back and sat on the bed, with my back facing the door. Just staring out the window, trying to process what I just thought I saw. Then there was a knock on the door. I spun around only to see the ED nurse poke her head in through the door to let me know we had a patient in the ED I needed to see. I never saw the dark figure again, and I hope I never do. There is a story about a psychologist who took on the job of trying to help at a very disturbed criminal psych hospital. He used Ho'oponopono, which involved sitting with each patient's chart and basically praying for each one. Before he started, the place was a mess. The stories are so creepy. The paint would literally melt off the walls. They painted and they couldn't get the stupid walls to stay painted. So many other horrible, seemingly paranormal, things were happening all the time. Staff turnover was constant. The criminally insane men in there were not helped by any treatment, or any staff, and so the hopelessness of the situation was extreme. So this guy, who did happen to be a shrink, starts doing his ancient Hawaiian healing stuff, and slowly things start getting better. For the first time in years, and this guy never met with a single patient. He never held staff meetings. He just sat in his office, doing the Ho'oponopono. All of this is documented, and what happened is that one by one, these men began to get better and were discharged or transferred to other places, lower level of care. Oh, and the paint finally just stayed on the walls. Eventually, they were down to just a few patients and they shut the place down. Since reading about this, I had a chance to take a weekend course on Ho'oponopono and it was very valuable. There are books and lots of online stuff about this. The psychologist went on to become very active as a teacher of this method of healing. Dr. Hugh Len, so that's my prayer on All Hallows Eve and every other day. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. Not in any particular order, just those 4 things. Take total responsibility for all pain in a situation and ask for forgiveness, expressing only I'm on an on-call victim support team, so I often end up at the hospital at odd hours. This was around 4 a.m. I just finished doing my thing, and I was sitting in my car in the parking lot collecting myself and writing notes for my report when I see someone out of the corner of my eye. I clearly saw the blue of a hospital gown, but when I looked over, no one was there. I figure I'm just tired and riding out the adrenaline of the call, so I go back to doing my thing. After a few minutes, I once again spot something out of the corner of my eye. This time when I look up, someone is there. Standing on the curb in front of the hospital, I see a man in his mid to late 50s, thin hair up top, no facial hair. He's wearing a hospital gown and holding on to something metal, but from my angle, I couldn't tell if it was an 4-pole or a crutch. He wasn't leaning on it. He had this expression on his face of wide-eyed shock with his mouth slightly open, like he was trying to think of something to say and had totally stalled out. At this point I start glancing around for staff or something, because this man doesn't look like he should be outside alone. His skin is a messed up pale color, and he's barefoot. I can't see his feet well with the shadows, but his hand and fingers look bruised. As I'm looking around for staff, our eyes meet, and I know he sees me. I start thinking, okay, this guy can't wander around alone, half-naked and unmasked. I have huge chills, but I turn to grab my mask and get out of my car to help guide him back inside. When I look up again, he's gone. I looked all over the parking lot for him, but he was gone. There's no way he could have vanished like that in the split second it took me to grab my mask. I don't know how to explain this without sounding dramatic, but my skin crawled when he looked at me. He looked like a guy who was slowly realizing he'd died and didn't know what to do now. I still think about I worked at the Nix Hospital, which was built in 1930 and was named the first air-conditioned medical mall in the US. Here are some creepy pics. This hospital, now closed, is notorious for paranormal activities in the hallways and more commonly, the elevators. My experience happened to be on a ward. One night I was working on the 22nd floor organizing stuff at the nursing station. Patients were in some rooms, but they were the first rooms of the hallway closer to the nursing station, so we wouldn't have to walk all the way down the hall. For some reason when I was looking down writing, out of the corner of my eye I saw movement in the hallway. I looked up and saw the back end of a patient's gown and heel walking into the last room of the hallway. There were no patients back there. Those rooms were actually being used for wheelchairs, stretchers, and storage. Since everyone was accounted for in their rooms, I just couldn't get myself to go down there. Since the closing, which was so sad because Nick's hospital staff was like family. There has not been any purchases or renovations of the building. I want to go in there so badly and take pictures. Like I wonder if the codes to the stairwells and storage rooms still work. Is their old, totaled medical equipment still in there? I worked in the OR on the 23rd floor too and want to know so badly how it looks in there. The older employees that have worked there for 30 plus years had so many cool haunting stories of times at night while cleaning or the elevator buttons randomly lighting up with no one else on them. Or at night, when absolutely no one else is there, the elevator will stop at random floors, as if someone is pushing the button on the walls. So spooky honestly. But I miss that place. It's where I fell in love with medicine. I am now in medical school. Which is way spookier in my opinion. LMAO, currently dying. I work as a nurse in a post-surgical unit in the biggest hospital in my city. Patients come from hundreds of miles away to get their operations here. The surgeons are known to be the best. But what we don't tell the patients, what we're not supposed to tell them, is that there are ghosts here. Just like any other hospital, people pass away and their spirits sometimes linger, or maybe it is just a fragment of them that remains behind, something that science can't explain yet. There have been more than a few events that have raised the hair on the back of my neck, and some have sent me into hysterical screaming fits. But those types of reactions are frowned upon in the hospital. So I try to stay calm. There was that time a few months ago when a patient told me she felt like there were 3 other people in the ward room with her, in each of the other 3 beds around her. They were talking back and forth and whispering, she said. But the weird thing was, she was alone in the 4-bed room. I pulled back the curtains and showed her myself. All of the other beds were empty, and there were no visitors or staff in the room with her. As if that weren't disturbing enough, a few weeks later a different patient said the exact same thing, when she had been left alone in the same room. She described it exactly the same way, saying they were whispering back and forth and it was keeping her awake. I felt a chill up my spine when she told me that, but reassured her that the room was empty, and she was simply imagining things. People have enough to worry about when they're recovering from surgery. We don't need them fretting about specters and ghosts when they should be worried about physio and discharge appointments, lifting restrictions and medication adjustments. So we keep these stories to ourselves. Some nurses said they couldn't sleep in a certain storage room during breaks on night shift, since they'd had too many bad experiences there. When I asked them about it they said they'd had bad dreams, and felt like someone was in the room with them, standing over them while they slept. I didn't believe in those things myself, so I slept in there on the night shift and found out firsthand why nobody else wanted to use it as a nap room during breaks. I had the most realistic waking dream I'd ever had, where I'd awoken in the storage room and felt like someone was in there with me, watching me from the corner of the room, their dark outline visible in the dim room. When I went to turn on the lights they didn't work, and the door wouldn't open, and for some reason in my dream which seemed like reality I chose to lie back down and go to sleep again, while the thing crept closer and closer, vanishing only to reappear just above me. It felt like my eyes were open the whole time and I was forced to watch, paralyzed, as it hovered over top of me. For what felt like hours, it was watching me while I slept, as I struggled and was unable to move. I finally came to my senses and finished my break early, going back to work and trying to forget about the horrible experience. But I refused to sleep in that storage room again. There was another event which haunts me to this day, especially since I'm heading in for a night shift right now, in just a few minutes. Another nurse told me a story on the night shift last week and I've been thinking about it a lot since then, and it's been occupying my mind more and more, especially when I'm alone in the break room at night. We have a staff room where there are 2 small couches and a TV. Some nurses go in there to sleep during breaks on the night shift and we try our best not to wake them up. She was sleeping on the couch there one night and a bright light woke her up. There's an adjoining room with a bathroom and lockers, so she figured one of the nurses had gone in there and left the light on. I looked over at the door, she told me. You know how it has that little glass window and you can see through to the other side? Yeah, I said. I see it every day. So, there's this woman on the other side of the door. And she's looking at me through the glass. I got shivers up my spine when she said this. Maybe because it was the night shift, maybe because that was where I was going on my break in an hour to sleep, or at least try to. And so I see her there, but she's not really looking at me. She's just kinda staring straight ahead. And the first thing I notice about her is her hair. It was in this very old-fashioned sort of style, not like anything you'd see today. It was like it was from the 70s or earlier maybe. And she was wearing these funky blue pinstripe scrubs. And a nurse's cap. You know, nobody wears a cap anymore these days. And those scrubs. They looked like the ones, you know, in the lobby, how they have those ones on display. From way back when. Yeah, they looked just like that. I was nodding along, able to picture all of it, as if I was there with her. Another nurse walked in and heard us. What are you guys talking? Ghosts, I replied simply. He scoffed. You guys believe in that stuff? The two of us shared a knowing look. He hadn't been working on the floor long enough to have seen them himself. And some people just aren't attuned to these things. The nurse went back to her story. So she's just standing there, staring straight ahead. And I thought it was the floor nurse at first. Because sometimes they'd come in during the night shift and use the bathroom or whatever. So I yelled at her, "Hey! Turn that light off, will ya? I'm trying to sleep in here." But she just kept staring straight ahead. So I just put the pillow over my head and tried to sleep some more. Then when I woke up later on and that light was still on. So I asked around. Nobody came in there during the night. And that room is locked, so it wasn't a patient. And I saw the floor nurse later on and they were not dressed like that. So, yeah. I'm pretty sure I know who it was. According to her, the woman was the ghost of a nurse who had died driving home after a long night shift, and had fallen asleep at the wheel. Based on the description she'd given, an older coworker had recognized her. She'd said that was exactly what an old nurse who used to work there looked like. And from that point on, the nurse who told me this story always remembered to stay awake behind the wheel on the drive home. Every time my eyes start to blink and I'm getting tired, man, I think about that old nurse with the curly gray hair standing behind the glass and I'm wide awake again. Better than a frickin' cup of coffee, I'll tell you. Something occurred to me as she finished the story. That's really weird. My patient in room 14 told me last night that they saw someone peeking their head in the room and looking at them. And sometimes they would stand in the doorway and just stare at them for a while. She said the person had a very old-fashioned haircut, an old-fashioned scrub. She thought it was a ghost or maybe a hallucination. Ghosts and hallucinations are commonplace on the post-surgical floor, and sometimes it can be difficult to tell the two apart. Pain medication-induced postoperative delirium is not unheard of, especially in the elderly. She thought it was the Dilaudid. So none of that tonight. Just sticking with Tylenol. Good idea, the other nurse said, and I excused myself. I figured I'd check on my patients. Especially the ones in room 14. I was somewhat unsurprised to see a woman in blue pinstripe scrubs with a cap looking in at them from the doorway. Despite my terror, I began to walk on shaky legs down the hall towards her. She turned to look at me and went away from the patient's room, going down the side hall at the end of the unit. I ran to catch up with her, needing to see for myself who she was. When I got to the end of the hall, I looked to the left. She was gone. But it had only been a few seconds. I ran down the short length of hallway to the next corridor. This other one was much, much longer. She could not have disappeared so quickly unless she went into a patient room. But again, she was gone. My heart hammering in my chest, I refused to believe it was a ghost. Such things didn't exist. They just couldn't. Room 9 was the only one she could have gone into in such a hurry. I went in and found all of the patients were wide awake, despite the late hour of the night. It was 3 a.m., and everyone should have been asleep. "It's freezing in here, can you get me a warm blanket?" asked the patient by the door. I told her I would and she nearly screamed in fright. "Oh my goodness," the old woman said, startled. "I didn't see you there." "So who were you talking to?" I asked. "The other nurse. The one who just came in." "Where did she go?" I felt a presence behind me and looked to see the shape of something moving, but then it was gone, like a wisp of smoke on a windy. Not wanting to tell the woman it had been a ghost, I just made up an excuse and told the woman I'd get her a warm blanket. Nothing seemed to help, though. None of the patients in that room slept very well that night. If at all. They kept saying they felt like there was something laying in the bed right next to them. Come to think of it, it's the same room where patients kept imagining other people were in the room with them. Except this time it really was full. I haven't seen the ghost nurse since that night. And I'm hoping I never do again. It's terrifying to say the least, since I don't really understand why she's here. And you never know exactly when she's going to show up. I'm heading into work for another night shift now. Wish me luck.